Good evening. Thanks for coming tonight on Thursday. I know many of you are in class typically at this time. If you've snuck out, then I sanction it for this evening. I'll give you a note. Tonight is, I think, a special night. We have Will Alsop here in Los Angeles for a talk to present work that I think is having a huge impact on the landscape in Europe, and I think potentially for their practice absolutely around the world. I first heard Will lecture 6 years ago when I was teaching a unit for a brief bit at the Bartlett. And at that time, among many, many projects, he showed really Alsop and Stormer's first large constructed work, the regional government headquarters in Marseille. I'm sure many of you have seen it and know it well. And at one point during the explanation of the project, there's a public space in between a couple of long slab buildings, which he at first called an atrium, but then warned the audience that it actually wasn't an atrium and proceeded to call it not an atrium after that in the explanation of the project. What fascinated me at that moment was he could have perhaps invented a new term to say this is not an atrium, it is a new space. And to articulate the idea in a way through a kind of negative condition, placed a kind of critique on a kind of normative spatial strategy that we see developed obviously in shopping malls and hotels. That's an extrapolation of a street, etc., glazed, enclosed, privatized, climatized, etc. But as one went on in the lecture, one could see how Will's work, though it works off of modernist principles and even contemporary principles potentially called atriums, there was something that was quite twisted, quite subversive, possibly distressing in a very, very powerful sense, that the principles at work were being pushed to a particular kind of limit, though at the same time the work always felt simple, it felt controlled, and incredibly clear at the level of schema for the sites and for the program. In the new work, which we'll see quite a bit, I think you'll all be astonished at the level of production of Alsop and Stormer. Color, glazing, envelopes, a kind of condition of precision without fetish, a particular kind of technological exploration without the same kind of fetish systems that perhaps some British architects are known for. A certain way in which basic modernist typologies like buildings on columns operate not only as a means to sort of save land in the social sense, but also produce a kind of new spatial condition that modernism on the one hand was only looking to deal with in a kind of expedient sense. These buildings generate a kind of turn on those modernist principles. Flexibility, openness, and also a commitment to environmental issues also pervades the work, and I think that you'll see that tonight. The interesting kinds of discourses that are happening in Europe primarily relative to the concept of green, the concept of low energy consumption and uses, goes on in a way, in such an experimental fashion that does not ballast a particular sort of formal language. In fact, it gives rise to I think, new aspects of formal languages here in America, whether it's politics or a sort of still overwhelming reference to kind of 70s work, which had such a kind of deliberate, on the one hand, commitment to systems, but with no sense of exploration of how those systems would be integrated. Alsop and Stormer's work, I think, is brilliant in its exploration of that. Their ferry terminal in Hamburg is also a work that's been well known from the mid-90s. They have work all over. In Almere, in Holland. They've worked on the tube and the underground in London. Smaller projects, beautiful projects, which I saw 6 years ago, the Cardiff Visitor Center temporary building, are all, I think, amazing projects. And as I understand, Will also has been given a big project in Rotterdam for a very, very large, almost the size of Canary Wharf in London, which he won over Richard Rogers and Norman Foster and Rem Koolhaas. So with that, Will Alsop.
I wish it was all true. Thank you, Neil. That's great. I never quite really know what I'm going to say at these things, but in a very pragmatic way, I'd like to explain that there'll be 2 slides when I start on the wall, and the slides on your left I will not say anything about at all. Sort of architectural wallpaper, and these are sort of various projects which are either ongoing or completed. But I'm not going to talk about them because they're, in my mind, they're done. And the slides on your right is what I'm going to talk about, and I'll explain why shortly. The first thing I wanted to say really was that Brunelleschi was very ugly, which gives us all hope. I'm interested in Brunelleschi, not only because he was ugly, but because he could draw. And I get increasingly worried about some people like you in this room, some people like me. I get less worried about me than you, actually. Oops, things on wheels. He had an aesthetic sensibility. He started off as a goldsmith, could draw, learned how the ancient Romans, or in Rome, funny enough, could actually construct things. He made sculpture, which is rather brilliant. He outstripped Ghiberti, who was rather good looking. And because of that aesthetic sensibility, there was a relationship between his abilities and the trust that was eventually placed in him to put the dome on the cathedral in Florence. I find that extraordinary, because you wouldn't find that today. And I know, and you probably know, that many of our most eminent architects can't draw at all. I think that's a very worrying thing. And the reason that I worry about you is that you're all committed to sitting in front of a computer. But I'll let you know that all the guys in my office who are really good on the computer are all the guys that can actually draw. There is a relationship between seeing the world and being able to translate the world into this electronic box, which is, after all, only a tool. I like that. I like the fact that it's a reiteration, really, of a skill that we all know is important, and yet the modern world would suggest that it's not important. So Brunelleschi, apart from being ugly, knew how to put it all together. And then we had Boulez designing 200 or 300 years later a monument to Newton. And he drew an extraordinary form, big sphere, which he couldn't construct. And it was that moment, or thereabouts, that architecture entered the realms of science fiction. There's nothing wrong with that. And the point I'm really trying to make is that relationship between seeing and understanding something that can't exist now, and also remembering that you also have a responsibility to draw and design things which can exist now, is part of the art of being an architect, and something that is wholly enjoyable. I first went to the AA as a student in 1988. 1988. I wish that it was 1988. 1968. And I was taught by actually every member of Archigram at various times. So it's like a sort of Archigram overload. And of course, all the work that they were doing at that time and prior to that time was all in the realms of science fiction. And much of it was related to electronics, which at that time did not exist. And of course, living as we do now today, we see that many of the things that they wished did exist, do exist. Therefore, you can't ignore that. So this combination of drawing and the ability of translating the world to yourself as much as anyone else, the idea of knowing how to put things together, and the idea of seeing beyond what you know are the three most important components of being an architect, in my view. However, I don't want to talk about that at all. I want to talk tonight about my new role as community architect. It's a very important thing to be. Seems to me that there is no point talking about any sort of isms, modernism, postmodernism, destructivism, deconstructionism. All of those things are absolutely meaningless because they can all exist and it's all up to you. And the thing that interests me about the architects is their individuality. And any ism only exists because it allows the slothful architect to actually obey a set of rules. And I don't think the modern world is about obeying rules, apart from rules of smoking in California. But the one thing that you have, which you can do, is to follow your own nose. It's your sense of individuality, which is a special gift to you, that you can actually give to the world. And if all architects did that, the world might be a more interesting place. Doesn't mean to say that you have to like every element of the world. Probably won't. But at least it wouldn't all be the same. And sameness, remember the term, the international style. The very term is abhorrent in every sense of the word. Why should my mother leave London and travel to Milan and not know that she's traveled to Milan? That's a nonsense. Everywhere has its own peculiarities, and we all have our own peculiarities, and we should pursue them. They are our dreams. And I can't remember which poet it was, but he did say that in dreams begin responsibilities. And that's a fantastic thing to say. And that's what we should really be pursuing, in my view. But within that line, community architecture, if you have no isms to rely on, if you're trying to get rid of this sort of great cultural baggage that we all travel around with, then how do you inform yourself and others about what you do? And it seems to me that the general public, the client, are all part of the design team, sort of. It seems to me that very often they have better and more intelligent and more relevant ideas and notions and starting points than you and I. And therefore, how do you franchise them to actually harness their abilities, which you interpret, into something which is actually a surprise, both to you and to them? The element of surprise is terrific. And therefore, that's what I'd like to explore with you tonight. Therefore, the things that I'm going to show you and talk about are really related to that particular field, and perhaps is very much to do with process. And many of the projects that I'm talking about are in the making at the moment, and therefore they're very key. They're one, two old ones there, just for safety's sake, but they're all ongoing at different paces. And it's the role of community, the role of yourselves in relationship to the community, and the community is ultimately the client, of course, and also the idea of using your work as a process of regeneration, which is a huge topic, particularly in Europe, of how you regenerate cities in order not to allow them to spread to cover green land. In other words, a higher density of living, which is ultimately what it means. And if I remember to talk about it at the end, I'll then come on to what I call the usefulness of the impossible building. If I don't talk about that, you might remind me in question time. So if I could have the first slides, please. Ah, that was me that did that. Therefore, I must be on this one. Oh, these are actually the wrong way round. But it doesn't matter, because I'll go and stand over here. Can you still hear me? Yes, you can, yeah. Who here has been to Birmingham? I see, not many. In the conurbation of Birmingham are 5 million people. I always enjoyed saying that to Germans, because our second city is bigger than their first. But it's not as nice. Birmingham is a product of the Industrial Revolution, and prior to the Industrial Revolution was a village of about 200 or 300 people. And Hitler knocked the shit out of this place because it's where we produced many of the armaments that we ultimately turned back on him. And therefore it was destroyed. And I have a project here in West Bromwich. Now I could ask, how many of you have been to West Bromwich? Well, you're obviously all very sensible. West Bromwich is horrible. And in fact, when I was given this job, this project, which is, I had to win in competition, and the chief executive of West Bromwich was some speech I was making, and I told the people of West Bromwich that West Bromwich was awful. And he rang me up the next day and he said, "Do you mean full of awe?" I said, "Yes." He's paying the bill. Clearly it's not. There's an invisible line between West Bromwich there and Birmingham downtown, sort of more or less here. And this is the black country, and this isn't the black country. And the people in the black country are very proud. They They have their own culture, they have their own dancing, they have their own songs, and they never go to Birmingham. In fact, they're 25 minutes by metro to Birmingham city centre, and most of the people in West Bromwich, they've been to London, they've been to Paris, they've probably been to New York, they've possibly been to Los Angeles, but they've never been to Birmingham. And they wouldn't go, because that's a foreign place. I find intriguing. Birmingham itself also has this ring road of highways. This is the M42, which goes around there. This is the M6 that comes down here, and that's the M6, that's the M5. Okay, it's nothing compared with Los Angeles, but on the other hand, Birmingham is a place that you can drive to and park easily and get out of. You know, the car and the highway infrastructure is absolutely a double-edged sword, which of course London doesn't quite fall into that trap. It's hard to get in, but it's also hard to get out. And if you live in an ugly place like West Bromwich, it's very easy to get out, and although it's very easy to get in, no one comes. Here it is. Looks a lot like Los Angeles, really, doesn't it? It's a little expressway here. And there's the city centre, and that road along there, which you probably can't see, but neither can I really, but that used to be, before the war, called the Golden Mile. And it was called the Golden Mile because you could do everything here. This is where you would meet and greet people. This is where you would shop. This is where you'd have something to eat. There were restaurants and bars and everything else. And it was a great place to live. Then, in spite of the destruction by the bombing in the war, the real destruction came in the mid-60s with the city planners, who made an inner ring road around that and pedestrianised this part of the Golden Mile and then filled it with shopping malls, or malls I should say. And everyone goes there, but it actually acted like a corset around this part of the city which disenfranchised all of these people that live and work around here. This was the old civic centre here. And today, if you visit West Bromwich, there's a church here which marks the centre of West Bromwich, but the real centre of West Bromwich is a pedestrian crossing just there where people frequently get killed. It's a marvellous symbol for a town. Now, when I got this job for this community arts centre, the idea was to put it just there. And when they gave me the job, I said to them, if I take this job on, you have to give me another job, which is to re-plan the whole of the downtown West Bromwich. And much to my surprise, they said yes. So the idea I came up with, because it's the only way I could start, was to say, let's get rid of this inner ring road, which they've agreed to. Let's move that inner ring road up here. This is a bus station just here. Let's move the Community Arts Centre into the middle here and move the bus station to there, which is next to the metro station, which goes down to downtown Birmingham. And they said yes. But that was very important because the building could not operate in the way that it should do if it was here. My client have been operating as a community arts group in West Bromwich for 25 years, and they're very clever. They get money out of the health service, the education service, the prison service. They find that as a group of artists, that very often sick people find it easier to go and talk to them than going to the doctor. And very often they find that these sick people aren't sick at all. They just needed someone to talk to, and artists are easier than doctors. They are in England, I don't know about here. It's only cheaper in England. how do you start such a project? How do you begin to work with these people who've been going for 25 years and actually touch every thread of society within this town? And therefore I decided that we'd work with workshops. And this is just one sketch of hundreds and models, and I workshopped real workshops, i.e. people had to roll up their sleeves and really work and draw and write to describe what this new thing called Cplex might be. And I did it with old people, I did it with sick people, I did it with school children, I did it with kids that didn't go to school, all sorts. And there was a sense of ownership. This is just sort of well, this slide is just there so I can say that, really. And at the end of this process, which went on for a while, we ended up with this building here, which is not the final statement, but it represented two things. On this bus station, former bus station site, it's exploring the idea of a public square underneath the building, a public square in the building, and another public square on top of the building. So you've got three public spaces, one on top of the other. And then included in the building, in functional terms, what they call managed workspace, which is space for studios and new startup businesses. There was administration, and then this part, the pink part, which is a form of gallery, but a new form of gallery that is deliberately set up to be a visitor attraction in exactly the same way that Disneyland would be, but done by artists. I think that's interesting, but very good artists. Anyway, we got to this sort of stage after all this sort of workshopping and hard work and lots of discussion, that I thought we should talk to the city planner, because we had to have planning permission to build this building. And I got all these people in the room and invited the planner to come to a meeting. I explained this, and he said all the things you expect a planner to say, like, it's a bit big scale, materials context, the C word. And you could see that he didn't like the building at all. Whereupon I didn't have to say anything, because all these people stood up and they said, "Fuck off." Which is really interesting for me. It's a first-time experience for me. Because they all had ownership in the building. They'd all contributed to it. They could see their various bits and what it represented. And they said, this is our money, because this is public money that's paying for the building. It's our building because we've worked on it. And it's nothing to do with you. And the most interesting thing is, who are you protecting anyway? That's a good question. One that I'd always wanted to ask a planner, but never dared. And it's true, because planners for so long have felt, primarily when they have to deal with people like us in this room, that they start off by thinking that we're going to do a bad job or something terrible, and therefore they are protecting the public from the worst products that we produce. Unfortunately, 90% of architects need or their products the public need to be protected from them. But there's 10%. So I was interested in the way that you can work, that you can discover things, and there are things in this building which I could not have had any preconception about. People will look at it and say, well, it looks like one of your buildings, which it does, inevitably, and I make no apologies for that. But there are things which I could not have imagined at that particular time. Model of it, maybe the planner is right, it's a bit overscaled. So what? I was very determined to make it higher than the church. But also it had to be high, so you can see it from the motorway M5 and the motorway M6. Then I change it all. Got the same people together and say, well, that's fine. We've carved out a bit of a space, we've changed the site, we've got a new plan for the town centre, and now we should check it all out and see if there's something better that we can do. So we embarked on doing a building a week for 6 weeks, which I called the 6 notions. This is one which is very similar to the first one. Then this one arrived, which is actually a double helix. And one's a public route, part of the gallery, and the other is all the administration is on the route. And I thought that's interesting. There's a tabletop. I've always liked tables personally. You know, it's the horizontal plane of social discourse. Sounds better than it is, really. But the underside of the table here could then be seen as a fly tower, like a theatre, where you can hang things, you can animate that void in the middle. And that is actually the gallery space. I was interested in exploring that. We looked at putting everything underground with these protrusions coming up above ground. Didn't like that very much. Or we didn't like that, I have to say. Then we looked at trying to make a sort of more difficult building, although this still has the double helix inside it. I wasn't sure about this, but it could have been all right, but we didn't take it any further. Then it started to emerge in this particular form, where the high bit became a tower for the managed workspace. This became a health centre, and all of the C-plex and the community arts centre was put in here, and the yellow bit of jelly here is a restaurant. This slide shouldn't be here. So you can see at the working end of that with the tower here, this idea that by lifting up the skirt, then you could allow people to come in and people begin to enter the building in a way that they don't have to make a conscious decision to come into this part of the building. And there'd be a bar, of course. As you know, all architecture is ultimately about eating and drinking, whatever else the building might be called. And there's a very large lift which comes part of the event, and you come up to a street at high level called the High Street. And there are shops up there and places to eat and places to drink, and some of these shops, like the tattoo shop, actually gives you access to this world, this underworld here, which is the new type of gallery. And there's dark space, there's light space, there's the remnants of the fly tower and the ramps going around. This is a project which we're in mid-flow with. Going very quickly on that side, actually. It could be slowed down, that would be good. This is the Black Sock. Here, the ramps. And there will be picnic places on these ramps. Then, in the last few weeks, we've taken it a bit further. We've taken the tower off and made the building longer, because we could, but we've actually maintained the ability in the foundations here to create a higher place up here for future growth. We've been examining the idea of this external facade with portraits of people in the glass. This is all glass, so that in the day it looks like a solid object, although this would be highly penetrable, going back to the last image at the base level, of all the people who have been part of the workshops. And I like the idea that the facade of the building is actually fixed in time. But at night, of course, this all becomes then transparent. I'm not saying that Elvis Presley lives in West Bromwich, but who knows, he might. And then actually articulating the skin a bit more. That's gone away. And then bringing it back, this idea of the Golden Mile. There's the church. Demolition of buildings here, which has now been agreed. The idea of a large square. This is a horrible sort of image in some ways, but it's very important because now all the politicians have bought into this scheme of the large square. There'll be a new Safeways here, big one, and I've invented a thing called the Silver Kilometre to cross the Golden Mile. And that leads up to a wonderful park, a fantastic park up here, which at the moment you can't get to. And that Cplex, as a community art centre, sits in the very heart of the community. And when West Bromwich Albion, the local football team, win the league, at last the people of West Bromwich have somewhere to come and celebrate. Sadly, it's very unlikely that West Bromwich Albion will win the league in the foreseeable future. And as it evolves, we're now currently costing in to actually have a wall here that can completely slide off into that square, the enlarged square. So the square is now larger than the bus station site. So that it's kind of interesting for me that the original site, which was just the bus station, is given to this project by the local community, and now, through working very closely with them, we've developed a large piazza animated by the people who should animate such a piazza. And remember, the climate of West Bromwich is not very good. But it's all right in the summer. That's why you can slide bits of the building off and keep it open. And this is a long red bar. That's in West Bromwich. If you go to northern France in Airville, this is a project which I've been working on and off for ages. Here is a shopping centre, and it's very ugly. And here is a civic centre with the Hotel de Ville, the town hall, and the law courts and everything is here. This is a tax office here, designed by Jean Nouvel. And this is an empty space. And the mayor of Airville very much wanted to, oh well, the strange thing is, I wouldn't call this beautiful, but it's well intended as a piece of architecture. And this is a typical shopping centre, which is very ugly. And this is full of people, and this is devoid of people. And therefore it is important to make a link between these two. And this is, as I say, an ongoing project. The first idea was to do this. This is where the mayor invited 4 architects to make a single tower. This was the original idea. But I never thought a tower was the answer. I always thought a bridge was important, with some shops on it and an aviary full of parrots. Seemed to me logical. This is offices by Massimiliano Fuxas, the Italian architect, leaving the space underneath it that I should have occupied. This is housing by Otto Steidler, the German architect, with a very carefully considered light well in the middle, which was immediately, the light was taken out by Jean Nouvel with his Chinese restaurant and a hotel, which was the only bad words. Now, this is not possible, but it's another role in terms of regeneration by actually trying to work, and this is quite old, this project now, of actually giving a lot of attention to, and I always like the definition of architecture by Yves Klein, the artist, who called architecture privileged geography. And this is a very privileged piece of geography to have so much attention paid to it by a whole series of people. But I was right, and then it's commissioned to go on and look at the idea of just the shopping centre, which was the only viable thing that could be done. And this is my first idea, which is based on the proportions of a Benson Hedges cigarette packet, which the mayor didn't like at all. And maybe I didn't. So that eventually became this, where the shopping centre is underneath, and on top is the car park, on the basis that everyone messes around with the shopping centre, but no one messes around with the car park. And that would be the visible part of the architecture. This is, as I say, an ongoing project, and every year we add a little bit and change it and adapt it. And in fact, it's not quite like this anymore, but it's because it's a new town. And it's very difficult in new towns to regenerate some notion of a downtown experience. And when it's ready, this is what it will have. So it's a long-term project. Unlike this one, which is in Almere, which is about 30 miles outside Amsterdam. This is now under construction, this project. And what I like about Almere as a new town, it's more than new town, it's new land. When I was a boy, I remember being taught in my geography classes about how the Dutch were actually creating this piece of land. Little did I know that I'd come and dump a few buildings on it later on. And this is within a master, and so at the moment the population is about 150,000. In 10 years it will be 350,000 for this new town. But of course, when I was a boy, it was water, but all of this. There's a lake here. This is a master plan by Ram Koolhaas to create a new town centre here. There's a new theatre, which is a competition which has just been won. And my project was this block here, which was originally set up as a city block. And I didn't want to, and to do a water square here. I didn't want to do that. It seemed to be much more important, because if you do that, ultimately you're led to the idea of a facade, and then behind it you have a service yard. It seemed to me that towns are about multifarious routes, and then they become more interesting. So when I started this project, I retreated to the beach with a few sketchbooks and started to do this sort of thing. And when you have 2 or 3 full sketchbooks, which is 50 or 60 sort of evolving ideas, there's another one. The way I like to work is then take it back to the client body, in this case the council in the town, and also the private investor, and talk and show and talk them through these ideas. And then you can see where they begin to engage. The Dutch said, well, we like it all, which isn't very helpful, really, because I like someone else to then feed into this process. So that was quite difficult for me. But in the end, we carried on. This is a hotel. It's a rock concert hall. Underneath is a car park. And this is a new land level, really, so it's raised by 1, because you can't dig very easily in Holland, otherwise you get a lake. Shopping, there's a bowling alley, and a number of restaurants. Here's the model of it. It's the rock concert hall. This thing here, the other side is white, and it's a special screen from the restaurant over here where you can project home holiday videos. I like other people's videos. What I don't like is when they tell you about them. But I like looking at them. And so it seemed to me that it's perfect. And that's what I like about the Dutch, is that you can talk about what's on the face of it is a very small idea, and they say yes. And you think, God, I can't believe they said yes. No boring English person would have said yes. But they do. I think that's great. There it is again. It's a big bicycle shed. Sort of building type that you never get asked to do anywhere else except in Holland. Big bike shed. Of course, at school, the great thing about the bike shed at your school is that it was the place where you went behind the bike shed to have a cigarette. This is the hotel, which is actually all in timber. It's a rectilinear form. This is the bar, but it's slightly twisted, this form, so when you come out of the bar, you're not sure exactly whether it's orthogonal or not. You get down to Melbourne, and this project, I don't know if some of you know Melbourne, I'm sure. This is the River Yarra, and the central business district is here. Here you can see that the nature of Melbourne, which is sort of 3 million people, a significant proportion of the whole population of of Australia, and it spreads out 60 miles by 40 miles. So not as big as Los Angeles, but getting that way. And it's that size because it all breaks down into 2-story and single-story houses with gardens around them. small gardens. It just goes out forever. And then it rises to between 40 and 50 stories in the central business district here. And this is the cultural centre here with a gallery, concert hall here, another concert hall here. And what they want is a new museum of contemporary art, but they have no money. You know, this was an area which then qualifies for this museum. This is an old industrial area which is basically run down and defunct. Just here. So there you can see the central business district. And there you can see the edge of the middle of town. It's very like Los Angeles now I come to think about it. And you get this area here. Then you look at this bit of spaghetti here. And actually, as we speak now, they've already done this, is that this actually continues this highway down into a tunnel just about there and goes through and under a rather beautiful park here. And I thought that was a clue. So then our work for the state of Victoria, saying we'll take one arm off the highway to feed a very large car park here. Or you descend down into the tunnel. And you cover the whole of that site with concrete, preferably cadmium orange. And you put a 4-meter high wall around it, a thick wall, which contains useful things like lavatories, storage facilities, some offices, and you create security. So you do two things. You make a secure space, and you build a form of income, which is parking. Maybe there should be a second-hand car dealership here, because Australians really like second-hand cars. And with that, you then proceed to commission works of art. So it's a true contemporary museum of modern art. I like that very much. So the locals always have a reason to go back, because there's always something new, and it's always up to date. All this other stuff is just me playing around, just to try and illustrate the sort of possibilities. And maybe I should have been purer there with just the car park and the rectangle, the orange rectangle. I think it's an interesting idea. And museums, particularly museums of art, are a real problem because they're dead. Equally in Melbourne interests me a lot. The central business district is here that I was referring to. Here's the River Yarra, and here's their Docklands, which is quite a large area, separated by these railway lines. They are now developing this, but when I got involved in this project, it was to to report back on the initial moves of how to regenerate this. And it seemed to me that the only problem was these railway lines. So I spent 2 days with what's known as VicRail, Victoria Rail Company. First question you ask them is, how many of these railway tracks do you really need? And the man said, all of them. And clearly he was lying, because if you go down there, most of them have weeds and they're rusty and they're not used. And at the end of 2 days, he agreed that actually they just needed 2 of them, which was quite a change. And there is a sort of a lesson, really, that all people involved in large institutions, and railways are large institutions on the whole, always lie. It's very important. Never accept the truth. Because if you can get rid of those, you can make the connections. And it's all about connectivity, this sort of notion of regeneration. So the idea here was that you just concentrate on how to get there, with roadways, with cycle tracks, with running tracks, with a long, thin swimming pool. Swim here, just 2 meters wide, not too expensive. And if you can get people there, and then they can have a glass of beer at the end, then actually other people might build things in the rest of the site. That's what's happening. I mean, they're not doing the swimming pool, sadly. But the idea of infrastructure as a form of regeneration is absolutely vital. And this is North Greenwich Peninsula in London. And it's a very bad slide, deliberately, because the atmosphere in this slide is exactly what it was like, what it felt like when I first went to look at this site. It's an old gasworks site which belonged to British Gas, and the project I had was to build an underground, a metro station, more or less here. And this was back in 1991, I think, was the original request to do this. And British Gas thought that if they had a metro station, which is part of the Jubilee Line extension, which runs from central London over here somewhere, running through and serving this and then going on to Stratford East up here, with a stop here, that would actually be enough to regenerate a development that they wanted to do themselves here on this peninsula. So, seemed a good reason to start. Now this is going to be a cut and cover station. What that means is you dig a big hole, you make the station, and then you put the top back on. And for a long time I worked to say, well, let's make it a cut and uncover station and keep it open. The idea that a wonderful hole, which is 400 meters long, 30 meters deep and 25 meters wide, would be a spectacular centerpiece for any development that might follow. And the whole art was to make a very sharp edge to the hole here. You could buy a ticket, walk through a garden at high level, and then descend down onto the part of the platform that of your choice. And there were significant advantages in that, insofar that you didn't have to use daylight, you didn't have to use artificial light during the daytime. Women at night down here would feel at least connected to the surface of the earth, which is quite important, so it felt safer. You wouldn't have to worry about pulling smoke out of here in the event of a fire, and so on and so forth. I nearly got this through. London Underground, my client, agreed with it, and eventually British Gas agreed with it, and they had one price, which was to change the name of the station from North Greenwich Station to Port of Greenwich, which to you and I sounds a better name for a station. But London Underground wouldn't do that because this was going through a parliamentary bill, and if all the names of all the stations were part of the bill, and if you changed the name, it would delay it by 2 months. Therefore, I had to put the top back on. But you can see what I mean, that from these construction shots, that a large hole would be fantastic, wouldn't it? You can say yes. Yeah, look at that. Fantastic. Fantastic concrete work here. All done by Germans, I have to say. The other thing I was intrigued by building a big hole, by having such a large hole, it then delivered you to a very small hole, which is the whole point of the big hole, if you see what I mean. rather beautiful. This idea that you've been this huge hole looking, and to take all the artificial light, which actually I've still done, actually back through into the regular tunnel where the train emerges. That would be very beautiful, this contrast. And this is it, again under construction now with the roof on. And then the result, which I made, well, some people thought I was being perverse, that I couldn't have a day-lit station, and therefore I made it like permanent night by making it very dark blue. But actually I did a lot of experiments with the notion of large underground space, and what I was trying to do was to put as little down there as possible to open up the volume of the hole and to maintain that, and also so you couldn't see the edge of the hole. And if you make it a bright color, white or yellow or anything bright, then you see the edge of the hole and it's no good. But if you make it a dark color, and it could have been green, worked quite well, but in my view blue worked better, then it becomes more of a sort of Piranesi type quality to the space where you're not sure where the edges are. And also I want to see the actual depth of the hole from, this would have been the garden, of course, without the roof. And then you can look down to the platform levels here. Then with the addition over the third platform, the third platform, along the whole length of the station I put a Bristol blue transparent glass element here, which you can just see through. It actually hides some plant work, which you can see through there. But again, this whole side of the box, you really can't see the edge of. You know there's something beyond. This is just straightforward blue glass mosaic on the columns and on the edge here. What I found really satisfying is that when this project, well, I mean, it's been open a few months now, but when the dome, the Millennium Dome, opened to the public on January the 1st, and the radio stations interviewed people about the dome, they all said, "We like the station." I thought that was terrific. But I would, wouldn't I? And above ground, of course, and you have to remember that this is an extraordinary story by Richard Rogers. This big tent, which is 700 meters in diameter, wouldn't be there without the tube station. This is a bus station by Norman Foster. And you had to go, sadly, through this station, through this bus station to get to my station. Never mind. But of course, my station is not the only station on the line. Further back, on the other side of the river, is Canary Wharf here, which also has a new station. Also by Norman Foster. And this tower, which is one of the solitary towers in London, is now going to be joined by 3 other towers of about the same height, one of which is by Norman Foster. But none of that would be built without this new tube line. I love Norman, really. So glad he's getting older. There are other sort of regenerative qualities which are not so good. See the Express Holiday Inn. Now I can't understand how we can end up with such a pile of shit when there's been so much effort poured into all the rest of this peninsula. And sadly, even this bit of crap looks much better than the thing that's going to emerge behind this hoarding here, which is what they call the Millennium Village. I'm fed up with the word millennium, and I'm quite glad that it's going out of fashion, because it's a very hard word to spell. However, in spite of this being very poor, this thing that's going to emerge, in my view, housing done by the aged for the aged, I'd rather it was there than was not. Not so far away from North Greenwich is a place called Peckham. And Peckham is an inner city area with a large multicultural resident population, and has a street called Peckham Rye, which goes up here, which is full of sort of shops, normal shops. And this is in the borough of Southwark. And the borough of Southwark commissioned a firm of agents, or realtors you would call them, to do a study about the future of Peckham town centre. You must remember that London is a series of villages which are linked, so they're all with their own centres. And £100,000 later, these agents came back and said, Peckham doesn't have a future. Ah, that's a bit sad. But of course, what they were looking at, its future as a shopping centre. Well, it's already okay as a shopping centre, and there is no need for any other shops. But it needs some other things. So the Borough of Southwark decided that actually they would use public money to begin to regenerate and create a sense of Peckham town centre. The first thing they did was to build an arch by some architects called Troughton and Caslin. And I thought that was very clever. It's not a bad arch, it's quite interesting. And everyone started to talk about Peckham because of this arch. And all the locals said, well, that's a fucking waste of money. It's an arch to nowhere. Though this actually was a canal down here, which they filled in a long time ago. And there's a sort of linear park that leads to a much bigger park called Burgess Park, which is a new park in London. So everyone hated this arch, not because of what it looked like, but because of what it represented. What Southwark didn't say is that they were going to build here a new health centre and swimming pool complex with a sort of cafe attached, and that's finished and open, and I go swimming there from time to time. And that furthermore, they're going to do this extraordinary library by me. Here, new public library. And they envisaged that I would just put a 2 or 3 story building just in this slot. It's not a large project, this. And I thought that was wrong, because actually they've opened up here, this is an alternative route from Peckham High Street, which is a very busy, smelly street. It's a street that if you're going to take your car through the tunnel to France, you tend to drive down the street to get out of London. And it's not so pleasant. But actually now it's possible to walk in through here, past here, have a bit of a swim, bit of a cup of coffee, go through this bit of new landscape which is still under construction, and then I want to make this another arch, another gateway, to actually activate the shops on this street, so that there was this alternative way, again going back to Almere, a series of routing around the town centre. So I did that. There's the arch, and that's the area where the library is now standing. You see, it's a highly contextual building that is totally sensitive to everything that sits around it. There's the arch. I'm sorry, these are under construction. Construction shots, but on the north side it's totally glass with different colours. That pink there goes on to the children's library at the top, and actually when you're inside and you look back at Peckham through rose-tinted spectacles, it looks much better. This is all copper. From the other side. So this is where you walk through. These are the shops I was talking about. The main entrance to the library is underneath. And this is 11.3 meters high, which I learnt from Marseille, that if you have the underside of a building, I think that 10 meters will probably be okay as well. But 11.3, you don't feel as though you're standing under a building. It feels like an intended space. And so I just reused that particular knowledge. Then you get this sort of French beret here for all the people that are actually driving back to France along the road here. I always wanted in London to put a freestanding sign on top of the building, because that's my favorite thing about Berlin. I have a lot of that. I'm not sure about the typeface here. I think I got that wrong. And then I put these French onions inside the library. This again, you see there's no books, and these shelves are not where they're supposed to be. Forgive me for that. But there's a number of these pods inside. This particular one is for storytelling for children. It's actually just full of cushions, and actually pokes out through the top of the library roof itself. So you can just sit there and curl up with your thumb in your mouth and just be read to. Which is exactly what I do with my darling wife. She reads to me at night. Go to Rotterdam. It's one of a number of projects in Rotterdam. Just here is an old grain silo. I can see it very well. I know you can't. And this ongoing project is very interesting to me because the city said, this is listed, it's a protected building, and we don't know what to do with it. And we'd like you to commission you to think about what to do with this building and what could be done. I said, supposing I can't think of anything to do in this building, what would you do? They said, well, we'll knock it down. Dutch are very practical in that way. They can't stand the idea of having something that is protected which is useless. So if it's not useful, they'll get rid of it. And I think that's rather refreshing. This is a message that I'd like to give to English Heritage, who protect all our buildings. And English Heritage is an organization which is actually headed up by a despicable man who always gives me a hard time, but we'll come back to him later. So I looked at this thing, saying that the structure, of course, is quite complex, and every silo is actually designed, it's in concrete, to actually withstand explosions, because sometimes grain explodes in the silo if it's not stored in the correct way. So it's a very difficult building to actually maneuver. But working with engineers, found that we could actually remove 2/3 of the columns on the underside of the silos, and then there's a basement. And you can take away the slab here, so you can get about 9.5 to 10 meters from underneath the silo down into the basement. And then I started to look at the location, of course, and there's a metro station here at the end of the building. This is all water in front. There's a metro station here, and on this metro line, on every stop, is a theatre or a cinema or some other sort of cultural institution, except on this one. I began to think about calling this an opera house, or style opera, if you'll excuse me. And I thought that was interesting. I became interested then in the idea of having a building which is actually extremely difficult to use. And the idea that, from something I've been saying for a long time, or suspecting for a long time, you know, that old adage which I was brought up with, that form follows function, actually it doesn't. And actually, if you then go back through the sort of 60s and the idea of the totally flexible building, which ended up in highly uninteresting buildings, the black box, that's not very interesting at all either. And then I went to an opera of Madame Butterfly at the Albert Hall in London, which is not an opera house. And it was the best production of Madame Butterfly I've ever seen, because the director and all the actors and all the singers, they had to work in a completely different way to make it work within this space which is not designed for opera. Therefore, this could be an opera house. But equally, it could be, when there's nothing going on in there, still an opera, because it's like a spatial experience. There's one thing that we can do as architects is to make life better. We can create experiences. We are magicians. We can create things that no one else can when we're at our best. But first you have to think about it, and then you have to sell it. And I've sold it here. There's another building coming up there. I said that would be a school. We're also looking at a lot of housing all the way down in this stretch on the waterfront. Saying that this could also be funded totally by a very large hypermarket here. Not in terms of the capital costs, that's not a problem, but in terms of funding activities in this space. So then I went to Menorca, as I usually do, to do a few paintings here, a few sketches. I had to edit these slides a bit. I found that my assistant had put a few slides of me in front of these to give it scale, but I looked incredibly fat, so to take them out. But this is one of my favorite places to work, and I think it's very nice, and very often I work with Bruce McLean, a Scottish artist, who's fatter than me, so I always like that because it makes me feel slim. And I like to work at quite a large scale. These are 4 meters by 3 meters. Now you can see the silo a bit better, and you see the context with the water. And from doing this sort of work, where you start to deconstruct and start to imagine how this can actually break out into the space in front. These are always used with the art. And then you take that, and you take the photographs which become a part of the work. There's Bruce, look. And then you start to work again on the computer to actually bring these out even further. And I've done a lot of these. I'm not showing you many tonight. And all of these things act with the client, with the neighborhood council, with the city council, where they engage in some interpretation of what you're exploring here. And what you're exploring here is informing you of a number of moves that you can make. And where we stand today on this project is that they've all agreed that the basic tenet of the whole proposition is correct. And so we go on and carry on working. That silo is about there. In fact, that's it, just there. But that's not what I want to talk about on this particular slide. This is a new bridge in Rotterdam by Ben van Burkle. It's very important, and this slide is completely out of date, because if I was to take this slide today, there's a 30-story tower here, or thereabouts, by Renzo Piano. There's another building here which is about to start on site by Rem Koolhaas. Here, there's a higher tower by, God, it's so tedious, Norman Foster. There's a lot of housing about to go on here. So this one bridge, this notion of connectivity, has allowed all of this area here to take place. There's a very nice new theatre being done by Peter Wilson just here. And what I am also interested by the people in Rotterdam is they have this bridge, which has not been open that long, and they're now thinking about the next bridge and where to put it. So there's Ben's bridge. That's the area, that's Norman Foster just there. And there's the silo down here. And they think there should be a bridge somewhere down here, but they don't know, and they won't build it for 15 years. So we began to imagine what they could do, what the first moves could they make about putting a bridge in and finding out where it should go. So I thought about a bridge for ants, or tightrope walkers dressed as insects. Because you could actually put this tightrope across in a number of different places. So it begins exactly like the arch in Peckham to stimulate some conversation about where to put the bridge, what it might be like, what the effect of it might be. I must say that the politician in charge of the environment hated this idea, but I haven't given up on him yet. I also quite like this one, which is the idea of a series of what I call lily pads, which might have a specific function like football, which actually then can connect up to form a bridge, but can also break up to allow ships to go past, because the mass of the river is a very busy shipping lane. But the idea of trying things out and allowing things to be tested, allowing things to become conversations, is a very important part of architecture, I believe. For the final set of images, this is back in London. There's St. Paul's Cathedral, just there, which actually Hitler missed. Which is very sad that he did that, because it's been a tremendous problem for architects in London, because there are protected views of this from all over London, from places that you wouldn't think about. This is south of the river. This is actually Southwark, which is a very progressive borough. This is the old power station, which is being converted to the new Tate by Herzog and de Mora. Should have been a new building, I think, but isn't. What I like about this slide is if we take this real picture in 6 years' time, we'll have an awful lot of me on it, and I quite like a lot of me about. This is the new station here. It's called Southwark Station, and it's on the same line as the North Greenwich station that I was talking about. And because that station exists, it allows me to do this, you see. This great big dollop of stuff here. This is the official walking route from the station along here, through here, to Hedgehog. And this is a straightforward office building, just canted up so you can walk underneath. But none of this would be possible without that. I'm also in the middle of, it's going through the parliamentary bill stage at the moment, of taking Blackfriars Station here and moving the station so that the whole of this bridge becomes a station, so that people can actually get off and go to the North Bank or to the South Bank and visit the Hedgehog. Here is the Mermaid Theatre and an old office space behind, which I'm knocking down to do a new banking halls here. And none of that would happen without this. I'm also redoing the underground station here, and hopefully I'll be able to knock this lot down, but I haven't got that far at the moment. So you can see that with the Tate here, the railway station here, you can begin to look from a master planning point of view, and this isn't the master plan, this is just a sort of stage that we're looking at for negotiation further on, but actually this whole block will be renewed. The Mermaid is in here. Here, the station goes across here. I spent a long time with the Institute of Contemporary Art to build a new art bridge here to relocate them from the Mall, but then it turned out they didn't have any money, so you can forget that. But the idea is right. You see, here's a footbridge which is under construction now, designed by, would you believe, Norman Foster. You can begin to see that this, which was a totally forgotten area of the Thames, has a huge future. And more importantly than that, this road, Blackfriars Road, leads down to Elephant and Castle, which will, in the next 10 to 15 years, become the third financial heart of London. So this is the station. There were 3 of these in sets. I've taken one down to construct a new platform as a new bridge here, and then to lift up this glass skirt to allow people to see up and down the river. There will be an increased train service along here to 24 trains an hour. And what I really like about this is that it also connects and allows people to go through London, so they can go from the north of London, which is places like Peterborough and Bedford and King's Lynn, straight through to Brighton without having London as a barrier. And of course, when the railways were first put into London, it was assumed that London was the destination, and no one would want to go through London to the other side. But business and social patterns have changed. I like to look at this station, that it's actually now possible that for the first time ever, for someone to live in Bedford and have a meaningful relationship with someone in Brighton. And I'd like to think in 20 years' time we should look at the statistics to see how many marriages have occurred as a result of this new piece of infrastructure. Now, there it is. There's that. I've had a lot of heartache about that because of this. And the main problem has been the height of this roof, which I think should be high. But I was forced to then re-look at this to bring this down. Same scheme, but actually to bring the height of the roof down, which is difficult mainly because of the structure. And I've looked very carefully here. So I've changed, this is just a detail, it's the only slide I've got here, at making a monocoque aluminium structure which is actually twisted in the middle, acting as a beam, so I get a 35-meter span from this, so the actual structure forms a meaningful part of the roof, then with glass infill in between those. So it's very interesting, it's like a sort of twisted bow tie to give it the strength. This allowed me to take 1.2 meters off the height of the roof. The other side remains much as you saw it on that previous slide. And this is the dealing floors which will replace the Mermaid Theatre, but underneath is a new music theatre which will be in the ground. And that's the other thing opposite the Southwark Tube Station, lifting up the front to allow people to progress around here. And the very last thing I want to show you, which interests me, which is, this was done really for an exhibition. And Liverpool Street Station in London is down here, and that sort of changed the equilibrium of the business heart of London and tended to push it through, and it's pushing up towards this area. This is a street called Brick Lane, which is full of Asian people with restaurants, and it's also a very important market, like a flea market, on Sundays, which runs through here. And this is an old goods yard. The idea was how to regenerate this area, how to actually provide housing at a higher density. And what really interested me was the possibility of actually introducing new forms of development without actually destroying what's underneath it. So you leave the integrity, because this is all very important. I think it's important. And therefore, how can you put something there without actually changing what's underneath it? We're going to look at this. Here you see this tabletop housing, which is only one floor, but creates an umbrella underneath. The idea of a coiled up street so that everyone has a front door on the street, which is supposed to be good for you. Children's hospital. There's a kindergarten in here somewhere, which I haven't got. And then underneath, already as we're sitting here now, there are artists which are busy within the existing structure who've actually planted a garden which actually is displaced seasons, so that in the summer you get autumn, in the autumn you get winter, in the winter you get spring. So it's like playing with time under here. And all of that came from a whole range of initial sketches, but this one in particular, I've always been very impressed and excited by some, not all, some of the black paintings by Goya. And on some of those which reside in Madrid, you see these huge rocks flying over a fairly conventional landscape. And this all comes, all of this idea of things floating and residing over an existing and familiar landscape come from this. A lot of people ask me why I put things on legs. Well, there's all sorts of answers to that, depends who I'm talking to. The real answer is because I like it, but also the answer is because Goya gave me an idea. I was happy to steal it. And I think it's also worth remembering that Goya, like Brunelleschi, is extremely ugly. Thank you. If anyone has any burning questions, I'm happy to ask. Otherwise, you can go and have a beer. Yes. Of? Oh, Francis Bacon, right.
Many artists do not
Well, of course, to me they're all beautiful, but I think that notion of always striving towards something which is aesthetically perfect, which is a highly subjective thing to say, is actually an ideal which is A, unattainable, and B, meaningless. And therefore, I often talk about the idea of discovering. That's why I do the paintings, and that's why I like the idea of working with people. And I have another project which I haven't showed today, which is actually a community centre in a very difficult part of West London called Wembley, where I'm going through that sort of series of sort of meetings where you get constantly beaten up. But the whole idea is that first they have to like you, and they have to trust you, and out of that becomes all sorts of possibilities. And if you judge those possibilities through your own sense of aesthetic, then actually you'll put a lot of very interesting things directly into the rubbish bin without giving them a chance to breathe. And therefore I think you need time in order to assess things, time to allow things to come out. And I know behind the question that you're asking is a much more difficult problem that I think you're trying to encourage me to say something about, which I don't want to say anything about, because that would lead me into areas talking about the grotesque, which actually then would make me refer back to some sort of art history in particular, which has no place in my work. So the answer is no, whatever the question was. Yeah. That's right. I mean, I'm not averse to a bit of a blob or a bit of a curve myself. Although what I've noticed, and this is a purely pragmatic reply to your question, is most projects you have very severe budget limitations. And quite frankly, if you're on a tight budget, you can forget the curve. It's expensive to do. Unless, well, there are some exceptions, which I don't have to go into, but generally speaking, it is expensive. And therefore, within my work, I have to recognize that, what I can afford to do, because to design what can't be afforded is actually a useless proposition, which is not very fulfilling, and not very rewarding for anyone else engaged in the process. And I mean, it's no accident that Frank Gehry had an extremely healthy budget in Bilbao. He could do it, and I'm pleased that he did do that. But then you can see what happens to Frank Gehry. In one of the other slides here was of a tower which I've got under construction in Düsseldorf at the moment, almost opposite Gehry's sort of Hansel and Gretel type thing there. And you can see what happens when he tries to force the curve within a much more limited budget. And it doesn't work at all. I mean, this is not a building that you'd like to work in. I mean, it's quite interesting externally. Well, one of the three buildings is interesting. I think the other two are not. Therefore, I don't think that's the way to approach it, that you don't have an inherent style, that style has to be matched to the social condition, and society decides on how much money they'll spend on things. I've never understood, for example, if you take Future Systems and the very beautiful, well, sort of vaguely beautiful pod that they did at Lord's Cricket Ground, that was 4.5 times over budget. Now, I've never persuaded anyone to spend any more money than the budget, let alone 4.5 times that. And actually, I've given up trying to do that. I'm quite happy to work for whatever the budget is, unless it's preposterously low. But you have to be I mean, that determines the whole range of moves and the palette of materials and things at the very beginning. Once you accept that, it doesn't actually stop you doing all sorts of things anyway. You, well, you look like a nice sort of guy. That's the first point. When you have to set it up in the right way. It's what I liked about being a student at the AA, that actually juries had a sense of occasion, you know. And what that means is they had alcohol and people could smoke. So it's creating the right ambience that is the first ingredient, so that you have a room which is well set up. You have to make people draw. They'll always say they can't draw, but actually everyone can draw, so that's not a problem. And that's just pure encouragement, and once they get into it, they do it very well. But they do it well because you give them very good quality paper and good materials to work with. You know, it's what I think is always terrible in children's schools. In the art class, they work on complete crap, and therefore it turns a lot of people off because they can't get a result by using cheap paint and horrible paper that's actually nasty to touch. There has to be a sense of delight in there. And it's actually very easy, given the right circumstances. It has to be set up in the right way. If you take it into if you do it in a room in a town hall where you have limitations on smoking and drinking, it just doesn't work at all. It's got to be the right place. I'm not really beaten up by the community. I'm not really beaten up, but there is a great. What I'm referring to is there's always a great deal of suspicion, and that's part of the sort of whole architectural baggage which I'm carrying, but not by my choice. It's imposed on me by all the sins of all the other architects that have done complete rubbish, and. I don't rule out the possibility that I'll produce some rubbish, and maybe I have, of course. But I'm not going to tell you about that. But it's about opening up. It's about saying, well, collectively, we can make it better. You know, and I need you to help me do that, and hopefully vice versa. So I mean, it's simply overcoming those initial suspicions. You know, there's an awful lot of people out there that think that architects are actually property developers or investors. You know, you're synonymous with that world, and they think that you become a millionaire out of doing it, and they resent that. So you should show them your fee agreement and say, look, nothing. Sorry? Sure. No, that's the critical thing. And to have a good time, just to relax. You're right, there would be a fantastic benefit in being able to take some of those contractors or constructors or craftsmen from project to project, but life isn't like that. And I mean, many of those projects that you've seen, and there are many more, are in very different places, in different countries and different cultures, and different ways of contracting out those projects anyway. So sadly, it's not possible, but it'd be a very nice thing to do. But I think it's restricted to some geographical areas. I want to say no one's ever asked me back. No, but projects don't come up. I say I'm a community architect. It's interesting that I've never done anything within the community in which I live, in fact. That's telling, isn't it? But then I live in Kensington and Chelsea, which is the worst borough in London for doing any architecture. I think it's time for a glass of water.